My name is Ethan Lewis. I'm 31 years old and work as a bridge design engineer in Chicago. I've spent most of my life building structures that connect people, but somehow, I've always been the disconnected one in my own family. I was never the golden child. I didn't inherit the family's business acumen, nor did I ever aspire to manage the Lewis construction empire that my grandfather, Martin Lewis, had painstakingly built over decades. That role was reserved for my uncle Edward, my aunt Linda, and their children, the ones who wore tailored suits and carried legacy like a badge. I chose a different path. I wanted to create something of my own, outside of the family name, outside of their shadow. For that, I became the black sheep, a quiet disappointment they pretended to tolerate at holiday dinners. My world shifted unexpectedly on an ordinary Thursday evening. I was sorting through work emails when a message popped up from my cousin Brian. It wasn't meant for me. The subject line was brief: Grandpa's will. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. at Harlow and Finch Law Office. Mom says don't tell Ethan, he's not invited. My chest tightened. The words blurred for a moment as I reread the message. So this was how they planned to erase me completely. Not even the courtesy of telling me about the reading of the will. I wasn't surprised, but the sting was sharp nonetheless. I sat in silence for hours, torn between swallowing the humiliation or showing up to claim my place, not for inheritance, but because I had every right to hear my grandfather's final wishes. He had been the only person in our family who truly believed in me, the one who used to meet me at the park to discuss bridge designs when no one else cared about my work. By morning, my decision was clear. I dressed carefully in a simple gray suit and drove downtown, rehearsing in my mind how I would face their inevitable scorn. As expected, the moment I stepped into the waiting room of the law office, Uncle Edward's cold glare pierced through me. "What are you doing here?" "Ethan," he snapped loudly, drawing the attention of the others. "You weren't invited. This is for family. I am family," I said calmly, though my heart was pounding. Aunt Linda scoffed, crossing her arms. "Grandfather made it clear. He wouldn't want you here after everything you've done." I clenched my jaw, choosing silence over confrontation. Moments later, Mr. Harold, the family lawyer, entered and ushered us into the conference room. My relatives smirked, already confident they had divided the inheritance among themselves. But as Mr. Harold read the will aloud, the entire room fell into stunned silence. My grandfather had left everything: his estate, his properties, his assets to me. Only me. The same grandson they had written off. And in that moment, I realized Grandpa Martin had seen everything all along. The silence that followed the reading of the will still echoed in my ears as I left the law office that afternoon. Their stunned faces were etched into my memory. But the weight of that moment wasn't about the inheritance. It was about finally being seen. Yet to understand how I got there, you would need to know where I came from, and why I had been so easily discarded by my own family. My father, Daniel Lewis, was the quiet rebellion of the Lewis dynasty. Unlike his siblings, he had no interest in profits, mergers, or power. He was an art teacher at a small public high school, a man who found joy in oil paints and canvas rather than spreadsheets and skyscrapers. My mother, Helen, worked as a seamstress in a neighborhood shop. Together, they built a life that was modest but filled with authenticity and love. But in the eyes of the Lewis family, that life was a failure. Growing up, I lived in the shadow of my cousins Brian, Melissa, and David, the golden grandchildren who attended elite prep schools, summered in Europe, and were groomed from birth to inherit the family business. They wore expensive shoes while I wore hand-me-downs. They played piano recitals while I helped my mother patch old clothes. To them, I was the useless cousin, the boy who would never amount to anything. They rarely said it out loud, but I heard it in their laughter, in the way they glanced at me with thinly veiled pity, in the way my uncle once said over dinner, "At least Brian will carry the family name with pride." Even at family gatherings, my father and I were always seated at the far end of the table, away from the main conversations about stocks and company expansions. I remember the Thanksgiving when Uncle Edward toasted to the future leaders of Lewis Construction while completely ignoring my father's presence. That night, I saw the quiet sadness in my father's eyes, though he never spoke of it. But one person always made room for us, Grandpa Martin. He was a man of few words but deep intentions. I would sit with him for hours as he built miniature bridges in his workshop. He didn't speak about wealth or success. He spoke about balance, about structure, about the quiet beauty of engineering. He showed me how to draft lines carefully, how to calculate load points, and how to see potential in what others might dismiss. When I was 13, he handed me a small wooden box filled with old blueprints and said, "These are from when I first started. They're not perfect, but they remind me where I came from. You'll understand one day." I never forgot that. Grandpa Martin shared stories no one else seemed to care about the early days of the company when his hands were still calloused from real work, not just handshakes. He told me about his first failed projects, his stubborn clients, and his wife, my grandmother, whom he loved more than any of his buildings. As I grew older, the divide between me and the rest of the family only widened. My cousins followed the path expected of them: business school, company internships, boardroom meetings. I chose something else. I wanted to build bridges not just as symbols, but as lifelines that connected places and people. I applied to a state university, studied civil engineering, and worked summer jobs on construction sites. When Uncle Edward offered me a position at Lewis Construction after graduation, I turned him down. His words still ring in my head. "You think you're better than us because you want to earn your way. You're throwing away everything we built." But it wasn't about being better. It was about being free. I didn't want their shortcuts. I wanted to build something of my own, even if it took longer, even if it meant standing alone. After that, the invitations stopped coming. Weddings, birthday parties, holiday gatherings. They slowly excluded me from the family's social calendar. I became invisible. Sometimes I would see pictures posted online of events I wasn't invited to, where they smiled as if I had never existed. The message was clear: I had chosen my path, and by doing so, I had forfeited my place at their table. But Grandpa Martin never cut me off. Even as his health began to decline, he would still call me on Sunday mornings to ask about my projects, to remind me to stay humble, to check if I'd finally learned how to properly cook pasta. We met often at the small community park, the one he built decades ago in honor of my late grandmother. It was our sanctuary. There, away from the polished boardrooms and business deals, he would tell me, "You have my stubbornness, Ethan, and that's going to make your life difficult. But it's also going to make your life honest." I didn't know then how much those words would matter. As my family drifted further away from me, Grandpa Martin's presence became the one constant I could hold on to. While they calculated inheritances, I collected memories, real ones. The Sunday afternoons, the greasy sandwiches by the river, the model bridges that collapsed under the weight of our laughter. And when the invitations stopped completely, I realized something quietly liberating: I hadn't lost my family. I had only lost the ones who never truly saw me. They say when you stop needing people's approval, you finally see who truly stands with you. After my family erased me from their gatherings, I thought the silent distance was the worst they could do. I was wrong. It wasn't until I became a real threat that they decided I needed to be removed completely. It started with the park. The Lewis Memorial Park was a small, quiet piece of land nestled between tall apartment buildings on the east side of the city. My grandfather had built it decades ago in memory of my late grandmother, Lily. To most, it was just another green space in the concrete sprawl. But to me, it was sacred. It was where Grandpa taught me about truss bridges, where we fed squirrels, where we sat on cold benches sipping cheap coffee. It wasn't just a park. It was our place. So when I heard that Uncle Edward was leading efforts to sell the land to a private developer, my heart sank. They wanted to bulldoze the park and replace it with luxury condos. The announcement came during a rare family meeting that I almost wasn't told about. Brian reluctantly passed me the message, perhaps out of guilt. The meeting took place in a gleaming conference room at Lewis Construction's headquarters, surrounded by cold glass and polished steel. I knew the moment I walked in that I wasn't welcome. The eyes in that room told me I was a ghost who dared to show up uninvited. Uncle Edward stood at the head of the table, his tone all business. It's a smart deal. The company's profits will spike, and the family can finally let go of underperforming assets. I raised my hand slowly. The park isn't just a piece of land. Grandpa built it for Grandma. It was never about profit. He waved me off. Sentiment doesn't pay taxes. Ethan. I looked around the room, searching for anyone who might back me, but all I saw were closed faces and tight jaws. No, I said firmly. I won't let you sell it. The room fell silent. You won't let us. Uncle Edward's voice was dangerously low. You don't get to decide. Grandpa would have never agreed to this. I shot back. He slammed his fist on the table. Grandpa isn't here anymore. It was a declaration, a warning, and a dismissal all at once. But I didn't back down. I promised I would fight to protect the park, even if I had to stand alone. That's when the real campaign against me began. It started with whispers. Cousin Melissa made subtle comments at family events suggesting I was spending time with Grandpa to manipulate him. Brian told mutual friends that I was pressuring Grandpa to rewrite his will in my favor. Uncle Edward, with his corporate charm, implied to distant relatives that I was angling for a larger share of the inheritance. The stories spread like wildfire. Soon, even people I'd barely spoken to were treating me like a parasite. Invitations that had already stopped became cold silence. When I passed family members in the city, they would look through me like I was made of glass. But worse was what they did to Grandpa. Under the guise of protecting his time and energy, they introduced a visitation schedule. They said it was to ensure Grandpa didn't get overwhelmed in his old age. But the schedule was a cage. I was given 2 hours on Sunday afternoons, strictly monitored. Sometimes, when I arrived, a cousin would suddenly drop by to make sure I wasn't alone with him for long. It was cruel. They were taking him from me piece by piece. But Grandpa was always one step ahead. We found ways to meet in secret. He would call me early on weekday mornings, pretending to need help with errands, but really just wanting to sit with me in the park. Sometimes, I would pick him up under the pretense of doctor's appointments that didn't exist. We shared quiet lunches at the old diner near the park, places my family never cared to look. During those stolen moments, he seemed lighter, almost mischievous. You know, Ethan, he'd say, tearing his sandwich in half. They think they're protecting me from you. But I know who's really protecting me. He started giving me things. Old maps, hand-drawn bridge designs, his travel journals. Each item felt like a secret pass between us, a silent confirmation that he trusted me, not them. On one of those mornings, sitting on our familiar park bench, he turned to me with an unusual seriousness. You've become the pebble in their shoe, he said, his eyes sharp. And pebbles get shaken out. I'm not afraid of them, I replied. Though the truth was, I was exhausted fighting to hold on to pieces of him while they slowly built walls around us. He squeezed my shoulder. Stay stubborn, Ethan. You've got my blood, after all. Sometimes, it's the ones who stand alone that hold everything together. Looking back, I realize now that those final months were his way of preparing me. He knew the battle was coming. He knew they would try to erase me completely. But he also knew I was ready. And when the day came that he was gone, I understood exactly why he had trusted me with everything. Because I was the one person who never asked him what he could leave me. I only ever asked him for his time. Grandpa's words lingered in my mind long after he was gone. Sometimes, it's the ones who stand alone that hold everything together. I held on to that thought like a shield in the days that followed his funeral. a funeral where I was treated more like an intruder than family. I wasn't asked to speak. I wasn't offered a seat near the front. I sat in the third row, watching as Uncle Edward gave a eulogy that spoke more about the company's legacy than about the man himself. No one looked at me. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I stayed. For Grandpa. 2 weeks later, I found out about the will reading in the most predictable way possible. A mistake. Brian sent a message to the family group chat and accidentally included me. Will reading at Harrow and Finch, Monday at 11 a.m. Dad says Ethan doesn't need to know. Keep it quiet. Seconds later, he unsent the message, but it was too late. For a moment, I considered walking away from all of it. I had never cared about Grandpa's money or his properties. He had already given me what mattered most, his time, his stories, his trust. But then I thought about the park, about his workshop, about the history they were so eager to erase. Not because they valued it, but because they wanted to turn it into profit. If I didn't show up, they would assume they had won. Grandpa had taught me better than that. On Monday morning, I put on the same charcoal gray suit I had worn to his funeral. It felt right to wear it again. Quiet. Respectful. I arrived at Harrow and Finch early, my palms sweating as I sat in the waiting room. When Uncle Edward and Aunt Linda walked in, their surprise was immediate and sharp. "What are you doing here?" Uncle Edward's voice was hard, cold. "This is a private meeting. I'm here to hear Grandpa's wishes," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "You weren't invited," Aunt Linda snapped, her eyes narrowing in disgust. "You've already caused enough trouble. Leave." Their children. Brian, Melissa, and David stood behind them like a silent jury, their smirks full of assumed victory. But before they could push me out, the door opened, and Mr. Harold, Grandpa's longtime lawyer, appeared. "Are we all here for the Martin Lewis estate?" He paused, reading the tension instantly. "Is there a problem?" Uncle Edward quickly stepped forward. "Yes. Actually, Ethan isn't part of this meeting. He's here by mistake." Mr. Harold's brows knitted. "That's impossible. Ethan is specifically required to be here. Martin was very clear about that." The room shifted. For the first time, they looked uncertain. Mr. Harold gestured us inside the large, wood-paneled conference room. I sat near the end of the table, every glance in my direction thick with resentment. Uncle Edward wasted no time. "Let's get this over with. We've already divided most of the assets among the family. Ethan isn't involved in any of it." Mr. Harold frowned. "I'm afraid there's been a serious misunderstanding. Nothing should have been divided." And as for Ethan's involvement, he opened the thick folder in front of him. "His role in this process is essential." "What are you talking about?" Aunt Linda barked. "Martin made significant updates to his will in the final year of his life." Mr. Harold said calmly. "His most recent will supersedes all previous versions." There was a long pause as the weight of his words settled over the room. Mr. Harold adjusted his glasses and began reading, "I, Martin Samuel Lewis, being of sound mind and body, declare this to be my final will and testament. After careful observation of my family over the years, I have chosen to leave my entire estate, including all properties, financial accounts, personal belongings, and the Lewis Memorial Park to my grandson, Ethan Lewis." A gasp filled the room. Melissa dropped her coffee, the cup rolling off the table and splashing across the floor. Uncle Edward surged forward in his chair, his face turning red. "That's impossible. There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Mr. Harold said firmly. "Martin was meticulous in documenting his wishes. I have records, video footage, and signed letters, all confirming his intent. You can't do this." Aunt Linda's voice cracked, teetering between rage and desperation. He was old. He didn't know what he was doing. Ethan manipulated him. Mr. Harold remained calm. "Your father anticipated this reaction. Over the past 3 years, he documented every decision carefully. He underwent independent mental evaluations from 3 separate doctors to confirm his full cognitive capacity. He pulled out a stack of sealed envelopes, each marked with dates. In addition, he provided a detailed log of his interactions with each family member, including notes on visits, conversations, and intentions regarding specific assets. The room spun into chaos. Uncle Edward slammed his fist on the table. Melissa whispered frantically to Brian. David shook his head in disbelief. "You forged this," Uncle Edward spat. "You poisoned his mind against us." I looked at him, finally finding my voice. "No, I didn't have to. He saw you for exactly who you are." Mr. Harold continued, his voice steady and unwavering. "Martin left a personal letter for Ethan, which I will deliver to him privately. However, he also asked me to make one thing explicitly clear to the rest of you. He did this with full understanding of the consequences. As the room began to fracture under the weight of the revelation, I realized Grandpa had seen it all. The lies, the greed, the distance they tried to put between us. And despite all their efforts, he had chosen me. Not because I asked him to, not because I fought for his money, but because I had never left him. They thought the will reading would break me, that I would crumble under their fury and walk away. But Grandpa had chosen me, and in doing so, he had unknowingly placed a target on my back. The moment I left that law office, the real war began. It started with the lawsuit. Uncle Edward wasted no time filing a legal challenge against me, accusing me of undue influence and claiming that Grandpa had been mentally unfit to draft his final will. The complaint painted me as a manipulative grandson who had isolated an aging man to secure his fortune. They didn't just want to contest the will, they wanted to destroy my credibility. Soon after, the harassment began. Anonymous emails flooded my inbox, questioning my ethics, accusing me of exploiting my own grandfather. My work phone wouldn't stop ringing. Sometimes it was Brian, sometimes it was Melissa, sometimes people I didn't even know, all pressing the same narrative that I had stolen from the family, that I had manipulated a vulnerable old man. But it didn't stop at me. Aunt Linda began contacting my colleagues at the engineering firm, subtly suggesting that I had been neglecting my duties in the final months before Grandpa's death. She insinuated that I had fabricated medical emergencies to spend time with Grandpa, implying that I had taken advantage of company time for personal gain. The weight of their campaign began to suffocate me. My boss called me into his office one morning, his face tense. "Ethan, we've had some concerning calls. I know this is a personal matter, but it's becoming a distraction. Maybe you should take some time off to handle it." I had no choice but to step away from work. My reputation, carefully built over years, was slipping through my fingers. I wasn't sleeping. I lost weight. My hands trembled even when I wasn't holding anything. The endless noise emails, voicemails, whispers followed me everywhere. For a brief, painful moment, I considered giving up. What would Grandpa think if I walked away? Now would he have wanted me to surrender just to buy peace? Then, just as I was on the edge of giving in, I got a call from someone I hadn't expected, Mr. Davis, the old groundskeeper of Lewis Memorial Park. Grandpa had known him for decades. He asked me to meet him at the park, and when I arrived, he handed me a small, worn box. "Your grandfather gave this to me," he said quietly. "Told me to keep it safe. Told me to give it to you if things got ugly." Inside were several USB drives, a stack of handwritten notes, and a pocket-sized voice recorder. I recognized Grandpa's handwriting immediately. There were dates, conversations, observations, even private reflections on his health and his interactions with each family member. But it was the recordings that changed everything. Grandpa had recorded himself over the span of 3 years, carefully documenting his state of mind, his memories, and most importantly, his reasoning for changing his will. In one recording, he spoke directly into the microphone. "This is Martin Lewis. Today is May 10th. I'm making this recording to confirm that I am fully aware of my decisions and the implications of my choices. I know some will accuse Ethan of manipulating me. That is not true. I have made these changes because he is the only one who ever saw me not as a title, not as a bank account, but as a person. I listened to the files for hours, tears rolling down my face. Grandpa had known this battle was coming, and he had prepared a shield for me. He had trusted me to finish what he started. The next morning, I walked into the office of my attorney, Sarah Blake, and handed her the box. Her eyes widened as she skimmed the transcripts and played the first recording. "This changes everything," she said, her voice steady and sharp. "They won't have a leg to stand on after this." Within days, Sarah arranged a mandatory family mediation meeting at her firm. She made it clear if they refused to attend, she would immediately submit the new evidence to the court. On the day of the meeting, I sat across from Uncle Edward, Aunt Linda, and their children. Their attorney opened with the same tired arguments about mental capacity and manipulation. Sarah let him finish, then quietly pressed play on Grandpa's voice. As his words filled the room, the color drained from their faces. Sarah played multiple recordings, each one carefully dated, each one delivered with Grandpa's unwavering clarity and intentionality. He listed the reasons he had chosen me, detailed his disappointment in their greed, and even mentioned specific incidents where they prioritized wealth over family. Sarah then presented the stack of notes, including Grandpa's own ledger of missing items from his home paintings, heirlooms, documents that had already been quietly distributed among the family without permission. "This is not just a case of contesting a will," Sarah said firmly. "This is a case of theft and defamation." Uncle Edward's lawyer requested a brief recess. When they returned, the fight in their eyes was gone. "We'll withdraw the challenge," Uncle Edward said through gritted teeth. "And the items taken from Martin Lewis's estate?" Sarah asked calmly. "They'll be returned," he muttered, "one by one." The family sent the stolen possessions back to Grandpa's house. Paintings, jewelry, old letters, each piece arrived without apology, but with the unspoken weight of defeat. In that moment, I understood that I hadn't just defended Grandpa's wishes. I had defended his memory. I had defended myself. The returned items slowly filled Grandpa's house again, but the rooms felt different now. The silence wasn't heavy with tension anymore. It was peaceful, almost like the house itself could finally rest. The fight was over. They had withdrawn. They had surrendered. But what remained wasn't victory. It was choice. What would I do with what Grandpa had left behind for the first time in months? I allowed myself to breathe. I knew I didn't want to hold on to everything. Some of the weight needed to be shared, not because the others deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. I carefully reached out to Brian, Melissa, and David, not with bitterness, but with an offer. "I'm willing to let each of you choose something to remember him by," I said simply. "Not the most valuable things. Something meaningful." At first, they didn't believe me. Melissa declined. David hesitated, but eventually asked for Grandpa's old fishing hat, the one they used when he was little. Brian requested the leather-bound journal where Grandpa kept his sketches of the park. There were no grand reconciliations, no apologies that could repair what had been shattered. But I understood that some wounds were never meant to be fully healed. Some distance was necessary. What I hadn't expected was the letter from Uncle Alan, a distant relative I had only heard about in passing. He had left the Lewis family decades ago, walking away from the wealth and legacy when he realized he wanted nothing to do with the empire they were building. Grandpa had always spoken about him with quiet respect, calling him the one who had the courage to leave. Uncle Alan reached out, not because he wanted anything, but because he had followed the court proceedings from afar. We met over coffee, and in him, I found a rare kind of honesty. He told me stories about Grandpa's youth, about the man before the suits and the construction empire, about his quiet acts of kindness that no one else ever cared to remember. Through Uncle Alan, I discovered parts of my family I had never known, people who had chosen authenticity over status, connection over inheritance. For the first time, I realized that my family had never been entirely lost. I had simply been looking in the wrong places. With a portion of Grandpa's estate, I established the Martin Lewis Engineering Scholarship, a program supporting students who wanted to build, not just for profit, but for people. I also invested in restoring Lewis Memorial Park, protecting it from future development. making sure it would always remain as Grandpa intended, a place for quiet moments and honest connections. When the park was reopened, I organized a small memorial gathering. I invited only those who had truly known Grandpa, not for his wealth, but for his heart. Uncle Alan was there, along with a few old friends, former colleagues, and the park's groundskeeper, Mr. Davis. Even Brian showed up, standing quietly near the back, holding Grandpa's worn leather journal to his chest. There were no speeches, no grand declarations. We simply walked through the park, touched the oak benches Grandpa had built, and let the wind carry what didn't need to be said. The legal battle had ended, but what lingered wasn't the memory of conflict. It was the quiet certainty that I had defended something worth keeping. I went home that evening, stepping into the house that no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like mine, but not because of the deed or the law. It felt like mine because I had chosen to honor the life Grandpa had lived, not the fortune he had left behind. The next morning, I sat at Grandpa's desk, sorting through his old blueprints when I found a final letter tucked between two sketch pads. His handwriting was unmistakable. "Ethan, if you're reading this, you've already fought the hard battles. But remember, the fight was never about the house or the money. It was always about standing in your own truth, even when no one else would stand with you. That's your real inheritance. The rest is just paper and stone. You don't need anyone's approval to know who you are. You never did. Walk forward and don't look back." Grandpa? I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my pocket. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I had nothing left to chase, nothing left to fight for. I stood up, walked through the front door, and closed it behind me. Not with anger, but with quiet finality. Some doors aren't meant to be left open, because true worth does not wait for permission to exist, and dignity once claimed can never be taken away.